Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next set of class video or class slides and a video before we get together for class. So this session, we're thinking about some of the core concepts around data breach notification, starting with what is triggering information. So this is in the text chapters 210 to 220, and I've listed out here pretty much the headers of those chapters, but as you go and you look at that, you'll notice that there's the words government IDs, social security numbers, health and biometric information, credit card numbers, financial account information, usernames and passwords, and a sort of an other bucket. So this is information that if breached would trigger a duty to notify. So it's personal information that if breached would trigger a duty to notify, which is why I call it triggering information. There is no such term under these statutes, however, of triggering information. So the statutes define these as personal information that if breached would give rise to a duty to notify. But be really careful when you're looking at these. This is where your charting skills are going to come into play. You want to go beyond just what the section header says. So social security numbers may not necessarily be triggering information, be personal information that if breached would give a duty to notify. You really need to look at the section itself. And in the main part of the book, so for example, if we go back and we look at, oh, it won't let me go backwards, never mind. But if you go and you look at the chapter that has social security numbers, again, as an example, it will give you an initial list in chapter, say, 2, whatever. But then you need to go back to chapter 9 and look at the specific statute to make sure that you understand and agree with where things fall on the list. And there's going to be nuances. So it might not just be government ID that is personal information that if breached would give rise to a duty to notify. It might be the person's name and the information. So when you're thinking about this, this is why you want to create a chart, because you want to be able to keep track, because as you learn information, you might find out that there were no names. It might be an Excel spreadsheet that has been compromised. And so it's going to be important to know, were there names on that Excel spreadsheet or were there not names? And you might not have all of the facts in the beginning, so you want to be able to keep track of what the laws are, so as you find out more facts, you can apply them. And that's what your chart is for. Another thing in the reading for this week was looking at unauthorized access and acquisition. So that's the other element. So if it's a breach, we need to have the fact pattern that constitutes a breach. And so there, for the most part, we're looking at whether something depending on the jurisdiction, whether it was unauthorized acquisition, it might be unauthorized access, it might be unauthorized access or acquisition, it might be unauthorized acquisition and access, it might be unauthorized acquisition or use. Usually access is the minimum, right? So somebody can go in and somebody can look at the information. That's access. The next step would be acquisition. They actually took the information, they exfiltrated the information. And the final would be not only did they take it, but they used it. So it's useful to think of it in that continuum. Some of the states in Chapter 230 also have this concept of compromise. So not just was it did someone who wasn't supposed to look at it, but was the information itself compromised? Keep that separate from the GDPR concept. That's a US concept. Under GDPR, the question is whether there was risk of harm to the individual. So there's lots of exceptions to whether there's a breach or not. So even if you have triggering information and you have unauthorized access or acquisition, or whatever the requirement is in the particular state that's in question, you may not have a duty to notify, either because there's no harm, because you have an obligation to follow other laws, because you have an internal policy. Be careful about that one, though, because that's an exception that isn't quite really an exception. That exception just says that you can follow what's in your policy, and your policy has to live up to certain requirements. There's a de facto exception. It's not really an exception, but in many jurisdictions, the duty to notify applies only to computerized data. So if the information is in physical form, then there isn't a duty to notify. There's also an exception if the information was encrypted or redacted. Again, it depends on the jurisdiction. And then sometimes if it was leaked, but the person who received it was an employee and they were acting in good faith, it was a mistake, there's an exception there. So those are all worth looking at. And in practice, what happens is we'll get a fact pattern. A client will tell us that there's been a compromise, there's been a breach, and then we will look at and we will analyze that fact pattern by going to the summary of the statutes, charting it out so that we can get at the nuances, and then applying the facts to the particular statutes in question. So it becomes a bit of a puzzle, and the charts are extraordinarily helpful as we work through that puzzle, as is the summaries that are in the book, which is why we made them. So hopefully that was helpful as you are going through and you're summarizing and you're getting ready for class, and I look forward to seeing you in class.